Your support keeps these stories alive. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell.
My name is Rachel. I am 31 years old, and I never imagined that one ordinary Tuesday morning would drag me into the kind of nightmare you only read about in newspapers. It started with a phone call. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee from my favorite chipped mug, the one my husband, Mark, had given me back when we were still dating. My daughter was still asleep upstairs, and I was scrolling through emails, half planning my day. Then my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Normally, I would let it go to voicemail, but something in me told me to pick up. "Mrs. Taylor?" the voice on the other end asked. It was polite, almost too polite. "This is John from Silverline Auto Finance. We're just confirming the payment schedule for your new truck." At first, I thought it was a scam. I laughed nervously and said, "You've got the wrong person. I haven't bought a truck." The man hesitated. "Ma'am, we have a signed contract here with your name, social security number, and driver's license attached. A brand new Dodge Ram, valued at $40,000. The down payment has been cleared, and the loan is under your profile." I froze. My mind scrambled to process what he had just said. Social security number? Driver's license? How could they have that? I demanded he email me the documents. Within minutes, a PDF hit my inbox, and there it was, staring back at me like a cruel joke. My name typed neatly on the contract, my address, my social security number, even a photocopy of my driver's license. The signature wasn't mine, but it looked close enough to pass at a glance. I felt my throat tighten. Someone had stolen my identity. When Mark came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes, I shoved the laptop toward him. "Look at this," I whispered, my voice shaking. His face turned pale as he scrolled through the document. "Rachel, this is your information. How the hell did they get this?" We sat there in stunned silence for a moment before Mark muttered, "This has to be some mistake." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew this was deliberate. I spent the rest of the day on the phone banks, credit bureaus, the Federal Trade Commission, you name it. Each call confirmed the same terrifying truth. My identity had been used to finance a $40,000 truck. Later that evening, Mark came home from work, still shaken. He sat me down and said quietly, "Rachel, I think I know who did this." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked almost guilty. "It might have been my brother, Kyle." My stomach dropped. Kyle, my brother-in-law, was trouble personified. He was 29, reckless, and had a history of borrowing things that didn't belong to him. He had bounced between jobs, owed money to half the county, and yet somehow always managed to show up at family gatherings with a new gadget, a new toy, a new excuse. I wanted to dismiss the idea. It felt too insane, too personal. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Kyle had been over to our house countless times. He knew where we kept our filing cabinet. He had once helped fix my computer when it froze, which had given him full access to my saved files. He knew my birthday, my maiden name, everything. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying every moment I had trusted Kyle. Every time I had brushed off my instincts, telling myself he was just immature, not malicious. And now here I was, the proud owner of a debt I hadn't created, for a truck I had never touched. 2 days later, Mark confronted Kyle. We drove to a shabby little rental house, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. Kyle greeted us at the door with his usual smug grin, but behind him, gleaming in the driveway, was a brand new Dodge Ram silver paint sparkling in the sun. My knees went weak. It was the truck. My truck, at least on paper. Mark's voice was sharp. "Kyle, did you use Rachel's identity to buy that truck?" For a moment, Kyle looked caught. Then he shrugged, as if it were nothing. "Relax, man. It's just paperwork. I'll pay it off. You won't even notice." I felt my blood boil. "You stole my social security number, Kyle. You forged my signature. Do you have any idea what this does to me? To my credit? To my life?" He rolled his eyes as though I were overreacting. "It's just a truck, Rachel. Don't be so dramatic." I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him understand the weight of what he had done. But he stood there, arms crossed, looking at me like I was the crazy one. Mark tried to reason with him, but Kyle kept brushing it off. Finally, I snapped. "If you don't fix this, I'm calling the police." That wiped the smirk off his face. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. But then he quickly masked it with anger. "You'd really call the cops on family?" he hissed. The word family hung in the air like poison. We left that day with no resolution, only a deeper fracture in the family. Mark was torn angry at his brother, but also burdened by years of loyalty and guilt. I, on the other hand, was done playing nice. I reported the fraud officially. I spent hours filing police reports, sending notarized letters to credit agencies, and freezing my accounts. Every phone call felt like another reminder of the mess Kyle had made of my life. At night, when I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I wondered how much worse it could get. Would collectors start calling? Would my credit score plummet beyond repair? Would my job be affected if they ran a background check and saw a massive unpaid loan under my name? But the worst part wasn't the financial fallout. It was the betrayal, knowing that someone who sat at my dinner table, someone who toasted at my wedding, someone I hugged every Christmas had stabbed me in the back in the most calculated way, and he expected me to forgive him. That's where this story begins. A stolen identity, a $40,000 truck, and a family bond ripped apart. But what came next, the battles with banks, the endless arguments with my husband's family, and the final confrontation that nearly tore us apart forever, was something I could never have prepared for. The day after confronting Kyle, I thought maybe things would start moving in the right direction. I had already filed a fraud report with the police, contacted the Federal Trade Commission, and started the grueling process of disputing the loan with the credit bureau. My mind was a battlefield of phone calls, paperwork, and pure stress. But what I didn't expect was the storm that came not from creditors, not from the bank, but from my own family. It began with a phone call from my mother-in-law. "Rachel," she said in that clipped, judgmental tone she always used when she was about to scold me, "why are you trying to ruin Kyle's life?" I nearly dropped the phone. "Ruin his life? He stole mine?" I snapped back. But she wasn't hearing it. "Kyle told us everything. He said you're exaggerating. He just needed some help getting a truck for work. He's planning to pay it off. Do you really think it's fair to drag the police into this?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My heart pounded as she continued lecturing me about family loyalty and understanding mistakes. I wanted to scream. "He committed identity theft," I shouted. "That's not a mistake. That's a crime." Her silence on the other end told me everything. She didn't see it that way. To her, Kyle was the poor, misunderstood son who always needed saving. And to her, I was the cold-hearted daughter-in-law making trouble. That phone call was just the beginning. That evening, Mark came home looking defeated. "Mom called me," he said. "She's upset. She thinks we're overreacting." I stared at him, incredulous. "Overreacting? Mark, your brother stole my social security number. He forged my signature. We're not talking about borrowing a sweater or forgetting to pay back $20. This is $40,000 of debt in my name." Mark ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn. "I know, Rachel. I know what he did was wrong. But Mom keeps saying it'll destroy the family if we push this too far." My anger boiled. Destroy the family? Kyle already did that when he decided his shiny new truck was worth more than my future. Why am I the villain here? Mark didn't have an answer. He just sank into the couch, head in his hands. For the first time in our marriage, I felt truly alone. The next few days were a nightmare. Kyle's girlfriend messaged me on Facebook, accusing me of trying to get Kyle locked up over a truck. She called me selfish, heartless, and even threatened that if Kyle went to jail, everyone will know it was your fault. Then came the cousins, the aunts, even distant relatives I barely knew. Each one had the same story. Kyle was a good guy who had just made a mistake, and I should forgive him for the sake of the family. I wanted to scream at all of them. Where were they when I was on hold with creditors for hours? Where were they when I was crying at the kitchen table, wondering if my credit was permanently destroyed? None of them cared about the stress, the fear, the betrayal. They just wanted their golden boy Kyle to keep skating through life without consequences. The more pressure they put on me, the more determined I became. I wasn't going to be bullied into silence. Meanwhile, the investigation into the fraud moved forward. The police took my statement, and the detective assigned to the case made it clear. This isn't just about the money, ma'am. Identity theft can spiral into all kinds of crimes. Your name could end up on things far worse than a car loan. That thought chilled me. It wasn't just about the truck anymore. It was about protecting myself, my credit, and even my freedom. If Kyle was reckless enough to steal my identity once, what was stopping him from doing it again? I also learned something that nearly made me faint. The dealership had a copy of my driver's license on file, except it wasn't my license. It was a fake, printed with my information but with Kyle's picture. He had gone to the lengths of creating an entirely new identification to pull this off. That discovery changed everything. It wasn't a moment of poor judgment. It was premeditated, calculated. He had planned this. He had studied me, stolen my details, and put together a false identity like some kind of con artist. The detective told me we had enough evidence to press charges. All I had to do was say the word. One night, about a week later, we had dinner at Mark's parents' house. I didn't want to go, but Mark begged me, hoping to smooth things over. From the moment we walked in, I knew it was a mistake. The tension was thick, the air suffocating. Kyle sat at the table, smug as ever, his car keys to the Dodge Ram dangling between his fingers. My mother-in-law kept shooting me glares, as if daring me to ruin her precious son's meal. Finally, I snapped. "You think this is a game, Kyle? You stole my life, and you sit here acting like nothing happened." He smirked. "Relax, Rachel. The truck's practically mine anyway. I'll take care of it." I slammed my hand on the table. "No, Kyle, you won't. You don't get to decide what happens with something you stole. You put me at risk. You put my daughter at risk. Do you get that? If collectors come after me, if my credit is ruined, if I can't get a loan for her college one day, it's because of you." The room fell silent. Then my father-in-law cleared his throat and said, "Rachel, maybe you should let this go. Families should stick together." That was the breaking point. The betrayal cut so deep, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I looked around that table, people who were supposed to be my family, my support system, and realized they had chosen him over me. When we left that night, I told Mark something I never thought I'd say. "If you don't stand with me on this, I don't know if I can stay in this marriage, because I will not let Kyle ruin my life while everyone else claps for him." Mark didn't respond. He just stared out the window, torn between his brother and his wife. And in that moment, I knew the war was only just beginning. That was the night the family truly turned against me. The night I stopped being the daughter-in-law, the sister-in-law, the wife they respected, and became the villain in their story. But I wasn't going to let that stop me, because I knew the truth. Kyle had crossed a line, and I wasn't backing down. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Every morning began with another phone call from a bank or a finance company, each one demanding payments or clarification. I explained over and over that the debt was fraudulent, that my identity had been stolen, but bureaucracy moves slowly and without mercy. Each conversation felt like a reminder that my life was no longer mine to control. At the same time, the tension inside my marriage grew heavier with each passing day. Mark tried to comfort me, but I could see the guilt eating away at him. Kyle was his younger brother, the one he had always protected, and now he was caught in an impossible position between blood and loyalty to his wife. Some nights we barely spoke. Other nights we argued until exhaustion silenced us. I remember one evening in particular when I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by piles of paperwork, letters from creditors, and forms I had to fill out to dispute the loan. My hand shook as I wrote my name for what felt like the 100th time that week. Mark walked in and asked if it was really necessary to go this far. He wondered if there was another way, maybe a compromise. I stared at him in disbelief. A compromise? With someone who had stolen everything from me? I told him firmly that I would not stop until Kyle faced consequences. For a moment, I saw anger flash in Mark's eyes, but then it faded into resignation. He wanted peace, but I wanted justice, and those were not the same thing. Meanwhile, Kyle paraded around town with his brand new truck like a king. People saw him cruising down Main Street, blasting music, waving at friends. I even heard from a neighbor that he bragged about outsmarting the system and joked that paperwork was just for suckers. Every time I heard stories like that, my blood boiled hotter. He was not only unrepentant, he was proud. One afternoon, after another long call with a creditor, I drove past his house. There it was, gleaming in the driveway, spotless and shining. Kyle leaned against it with a beer in hand, laughing with a friend. I gripped the steering wheel so tight, my knuckles turned white. The urge to slam the car into gear and run that truck into the ground burned inside me. But instead, I drove home, tears of fury blurring my vision. The breaking point came when collectors began calling my workplace. I worked hard to build my career, to provide stability for my daughter. And suddenly my professional reputation was at risk because of Kyle's selfishness. My boss called me into his office, concerned after hearing a voicemail about missed payments. I had to explain the entire humiliating situation, and although he was sympathetic, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Once identity theft touches your life, it taints everything. That night, I told Mark I was pressing charges. There was no other option. His silence told me he knew I meant it. The next day, I met with the detective again and signed the final paperwork to move forward. My hands trembled as I wrote my name, but a strange sense of relief washed over me too. I was taking back control. The detective assured me the evidence was overwhelming. The fake ID, the signed documents, the dealership's testimony. It would be an open and shut case. But what I did not expect was the reaction from the family once they learned I had gone through with it. The phone calls and messages turned vicious. One of Kyle's cousins left me a voicemail calling me a snake. His aunt accused me of trying to destroy their family. His mother told me I was heartless and would regret this decision for the rest of my life. Even his father, who rarely spoke against me, warned me I was going too far. It felt like the entire family had declared war on me. They closed ranks around Kyle, treating him as a victim, while I became the villain. I started avoiding family gatherings entirely, too drained to face their stares and whispers. The only person still standing with me was Mark, though I could see it tearing him apart inside. One night, after another round of angry texts from Kyle's girlfriend, I sat on the edge of the bed shaking. Mark put his arm around me and whispered that he was sorry, that he knew this was unfair, but that he loved me and would stand by me no matter what. I wanted to believe him, but part of me still wondered if his loyalty would break under the constant pressure from his family. The truth was simple. This battle was not only about my identity or the truck. It had become a test of our marriage, of whether Mark and I could survive the betrayal of someone we both should have been able to trust. The months ahead would prove just how deep the wounds could go. Because once Kyle realized I was serious about pressing charges, he stopped playing the role of the smug, untouchable brother-in-law. It became desperate, and desperate people make dangerous choice. When the detective informed Kyle that charges were being filed, his smugness disappeared overnight. The calls began almost immediately. At first, he tried to play it cool, telling me we were family and that I should drop everything because he would eventually pay off the truck. When I refused to answer, he started leaving long, rambling voicemails where his tone swung from apologetic to furious within the same minute. Some nights he begged me, promising to sell the truck and fix everything if only I would call off the police. Other nights he shouted into the phone, calling me a traitor, accusing me of ruining his life. His desperation oozed through every word, but so did his rage. I saved every single message, knowing they might become evidence too. The pressure from the rest of the family only escalated. My mother-in-law showed up at our doorstep, unannounced one Saturday morning, her eyes blazing with fury. She told me I was tearing their family apart, that I was cruel for involving the law when we could have settled this privately. I reminded her that there was no settling privately when her son had stolen my identity and committed a crime worth $40,000. She refused to listen. She demanded I drop the charges, and when I told her I would not, she burst into tears and accused me of trying to destroy her son's future. I will never forget standing in my own living room, feeling like a stranger while the woman who was supposed to be my family sobbed and screamed as though I were the criminal. Mark had to escort her out, and when the door shut behind her, we stood in silence, both shaken and exhausted. Around that time, the dealership reached out again. Apparently, Kyle had missed the very first payment. They wanted their money and were threatening to repossess the truck. The irony of it nearly made me laugh. He had risked my entire future for a vehicle he could not even afford to keep. But the laughter quickly died when I realized what repossession would mean for me. On paper, the loan was still mine. If the truck was repossessed and sold at auction for less than the loan amount, the debt collectors would come after me for the difference. I sat on the floor that night, clutching the papers, and cried until my chest ached. Mark tried to reassure me, but the stress was corroding us both. We fought more frequently, snapping over little things, blaming each other in moments of weakness. He carried guilt for not seeing this coming from his brother, while I carried rage for being forced into this nightmare. Our daughter picked up on the tension too. One evening, she asked me if Daddy and I were mad at each other, and it broke my heart to see how far Kyle's actions had reached into our home. The detective remained steady, reminding me that the law was on my side and that patience was my best weapon. He explained that the evidence was airtight, and once the case reached court, Kyle would have no defense. Still, waiting felt like torture. Every day I worried about new damage being done to my name. Every time the phone rang, I feared it was another creditor demanding money. The anxiety gnawed at me constantly, leaving me exhausted and on edge. Then came the night everything boiled over. We had been invited to a family dinner at Kyle's parents' house again. Against my better judgment, Mark convinced me to go, insisting it would show that we were trying to keep some peace while the case moved forward. From the moment we walked in, I regretted it. The atmosphere was suffocating, every word laced with tension. Kyle sat across the table from me, his eyes dark, his jaw clenched. Halfway through the meal, he slammed his fist against the table and demanded to know why I was doing this to him. His voice rose louder and louder as he accused me of betrayal, of not caring about family, of destroying his life over just a truck. Something inside me snapped. I stood up, my hands trembling but my voice sharp. I told him exactly what he had done, that he had stolen my identity, forged my signature, and put me at risk of financial ruin. I told him that every sleepless night, every panic attack, every humiliating phone call was because of his selfishness. I looked around the table and told the rest of the family that their blindness and excuses made them accomplices. The room went silent except for Kyle, who sneered and muttered that I would regret this. For the first time, I saw not just arrogance, but real menace in his eyes, and it chilled me to the bone. We left immediately after, and the car ride home was heavy with silence. Mark reached for my hand, but I pulled away, still shaking with rage and fear. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me flinch. Every shadow felt like a threat, because for the first time, I realized Kyle was not just reckless, he was dangerous, and I had no idea how far he would go to protect himself. The weeks leading up to the court date felt like walking through a minefield. Kyle's calls grew more erratic, swinging wildly between begging for forgiveness and threatening me outright. Sometimes he promised to sell the truck, sometimes he swore he would never let me get away with this. Each voicemail made my stomach twist tighter. I saved them all, forwarding copies to the detective, knowing they showed his desperation and his rage. But even with the law on my side, I never felt safe. Every time headlights passed by our house at night, I froze, half expecting Kyle to show up at our door. One evening, as I tucked my daughter into bed, she asked me why Uncle Kyle was mad at me. I felt tears burn my eyes as I tried to explain in the simplest way possible that sometimes people make bad choices, and those choices hurt others. She looked up at me and asked if we were still a family. Her words cut deeper than anything Kyle had said, because the truth was that our family had been shattered. When the day of the hearing finally came, I walked into the courthouse with my heart pounding so loud, it felt like everyone around me could hear it. Mark was by my side, pale and silent, his face a mask of conflict. Across the room, Kyle sat slouched in his chair, glaring at me with a mixture of hatred and defiance. His lawyer whispered to him, but he barely seemed to listen. My mother-in-law sat behind him, her eyes filled with contempt every time they flicked in my direction. It felt surreal, like I was the one on trial instead of the victim. The proceedings were straightforward, at least from a legal standpoint. The dealership representative testified about the loan documents, the fake driver's license, and the day Kyle had swaggered in, smiling as he signed the papers. The detective presented the evidence of identity theft, including the photocopies and the records of the forgery. My voice shook as I gave my statement, explaining how my life had unraveled since that phone call from the finance company, how my credit had been frozen, my reputation stained, and my peace of mind shattered. I told the judge how I had been harassed by relatives, abandoned by people who should have supported me, and left to feel like an intruder in my own marriage. By the time I finished speaking, my throat ached and tears blurred my vision, but I stood tall. Kyle's lawyer tried to paint him as desperate, a man who had made a mistake out of financial struggle. They said he intended to pay it back, that he never meant to hurt me, that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But the evidence told a different story. The fake license, the forged signature, the recorded messages where he bragged about beating the system, those were not the actions of a desperate man, but of a manipulative one. When the judge delivered the verdict, the room seemed to hold its breath. Kyle was found guilty of identity theft and fraud. The sentence included probation, mandatory restitution, and the repossession of the truck. He would have a criminal record that would follow him for years. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the bench, a wave of relief and sadness crashing over me at the same time. Relief that justice had been served. Sadness that it had come to this. The family's reaction was immediate. My mother-in-law sobbed loudly in the courtroom, clutching Kyle as though he were the victim. His father shook his head in disgust, not at Kyle but at me. As we left the courthouse, the glares and whispered accusations from relatives burned into my back. They would never forgive me for what had happened, even though it had been Kyle who set this entire chain of events into motion. At home, the silence was deafening. Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. Finally, he looked at me and said he understood why I had done it, but he did not know if the family would ever recover. I told him I had stopped caring about their approval the moment they chose to defend a thief over protecting me. He reached for my hand, and though I let him hold it, I knew things between us had changed forever. A marriage can survive many storms, but betrayal from within the family leaves scars that never fade. In the weeks after the trial, the calls from creditors finally stopped. My credit slowly began to recover, though the shadow of what happened still lingers in the background of my financial history. The truck was gone from Kyle's driveway, replaced by an empty patch of concrete that seemed to symbolize the hole he had dug for himself. He stopped contacting me, perhaps too humiliated or perhaps too angry to speak. Either way, the silence was a gift, but the emotional cost remained. Holidays became fractured, with invitations arriving for Mark, but not for me. Whispers followed us whenever we encountered relatives at the grocery store or around town. The label of the one who put Kyle in jail stuck to me like a brand, no matter how unjust it was. And yet, despite the loneliness, I never once regretted standing my ground, because at the end of the day, I had protected myself, my daughter, and my future. I had proven to myself that I would not be silenced, bullied, or guilted into submission. Kyle stole my identity, but he did not steal my resolve. Now, whenever I pass a shiny new truck on the road, I feel a twinge in my chest. Not of envy or regret, but of memory. I remember the sleepless nights, the broken trust, the cold stares of people I once called family. I remember the pain of realizing that sometimes the greatest threats to your life do not come from strangers, but from the people sitting across from you at the dinner table. And I remind myself of the hardest lesson of all. Forgiveness is not owed, especially when the one asking for it has done nothing to earn it. Kyle still expects me to forgive him someday. Maybe in his mind, time will wash away the crime, and we will all laugh about it at some distant family gathering. But I know better. Some wounds never heal, and some betrayals are too deep to be erased. I can move forward, rebuild, and even find peace. But forgiveness for a man who stole my very identity and tore my family apart is something he will never receive from me.